Sometimes, when we see someone in a strange place, wearing tired clothes, sitting alone in silence, our mind quickly creates a story before we even know the truth. We assume something must be wrong with them. We decide they made bad choices. We tell ourselves that if life became hard for them, perhaps they did something to deserve it. But life is often far more complicated than what the eyes can see. A person standing quietly in pain may be carrying a story so heavy that words cannot explain it. And sometimes, behind what looks like weakness, there is grief deeper than most people can imagine. Tonight's story is about one woman whose silent pain was mistaken for something else. People saw her in a cemetery and thought something was unusual. Some wondered why anyone would remain there after dark. Some thought perhaps she had nowhere important to go. But no one understood that she had already lost almost everything that had once given meaning to her life. What appeared strange from a distance was, in truth, the final place where her heart still felt connected to the world. This is not only the story of sorrow, it is also the story of kindness arriving quietly at the exact moment someone is about to disappear beneath the weight of loneliness. And sometimes, one act of understanding becomes the bridge between despair and hope. Before judging any person too quickly, we must remember that hidden pain often lives behind ordinary faces, because there are people smiling in daylight while silently breaking inside. And there are people standing in dark places not because they belong there, but because grief has taken them somewhere words cannot easily follow. For many years, she had lived what looked like an ordinary life. She had a husband, a home, a daily routine, and the small comforts that make people believe tomorrow will arrive normally. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, just a life built slowly through ordinary days. Shared meals, conversations, bills, laughter, arguments, and quiet evenings that only long companionship can create. But life can change in ways no one prepares for. Her husband became ill, and the illness did not leave. Days turned into hospital visits, medical expenses, sleepless nights, and fear that slowly entered every room of the house. The kind of fear that does not shout, but sits silently beside you. When he finally died, it was not only a person she lost. It felt as if the structure holding her world together had collapsed at once. After the funeral ended and visitors stopped coming, silence became heavier than before. The chair he used remained empty. His clothes still carried his scent. The clock still moved, but time no longer felt normal. Grief does not arrive like a storm and then leave. Sometimes it stays quietly and changes every ordinary task into something painful. She tried to continue. She tried to work. She tried to survive. But grief does not ask whether bills are waiting. Her job became difficult to keep. Her mind was elsewhere. Sleep disappeared. Strength became weaker each week. Eventually, she lost the job that had been helping her hold the remaining parts of life together. When income stopped, every unpaid bill began speaking louder than her own thoughts. And slowly, the house she had once shared with love became another thing she could no longer keep. Losing a home does not always happen in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it happens quietly, one unpaid notice at a time, one ignored phone call, one difficult decision delayed because there is no strength left to face it. She moved through those days almost like someone walking underwater. Friends were few. Family support was limited. Pride made asking for help difficult. Many people who suffer deeply become quieter, not louder. They disappear before anyone notices they need saving. And this is how she slowly reached the point where she no longer had a place to sleep. At first, she tried temporary spaces, small borrowed corners. Cheap nights were possible, but none of it lasted. Winter air became colder. Evenings became longer. Yet each night, there was one place she returned to, the cemetery where her husband had been buried. There, beside the grave, she felt close to the only person whose presence still calmed her mind. The cold ground did not matter as much as the silence beside his name carved in stone. To others, it looked impossible to understand. Why would anyone stay there after dark? But grief often seeks closeness in unusual ways. Some nights she sat quietly for hours. Other nights, she leaned against the stone until exhaustion became sleep. The grave was not only stone to her. It was memory, conversation, apology, comfort, and unfinished love. She would whisper words no one else heard. Sometimes she asked why life had become so empty. Sometimes she simply sat there because leaving felt harder than staying. In that dark place, she felt less abandoned than she did anywhere else. One evening, as the sky became darker and the cold began to settle across the cemetery, a worker nearby noticed a figure lying close to one of the graves. At first, from a distance, it was difficult to understand whether the person needed help or had simply fallen asleep. In many places, cemeteries become silent long before night deepens, and any movement there feels unusual. The worker looked again and saw that the figure had not moved for some time. Concern slowly replaced uncertainty. A quiet report was made, and soon the information reached local officers nearby. No alarm, no dramatic emergency, just concern that someone might be vulnerable in the cold. When the officer arrived, he did not come expecting a complicated story. He simply expected to check whether someone needed assistance. But when he stepped closer and saw the woman more clearly, something changed in his expression. He recognized her face, not as someone dangerous, not as someone unknown, but as someone whose life had once looked stable, someone who had once moved through ordinary society unnoticed like everyone else. That moment created a kind of silent shock. Because homelessness often hides behind familiar faces, the officer gently approached, careful not to frighten her. He spoke softly, asking if she was all right. She lifted her head slowly, tired eyes carrying both embarrassment and exhaustion. In that moment, there was no need for long explanations. Her face already carried the story of many sleepless nights. Sometimes dignity survives even when circumstances collapse, and she still held that quiet dignity even there beside a grave in the cold, dark evening. The officer did not begin with judgment. He did not ask why she was there as if she needed to defend herself. Instead, he asked whether she had eaten, whether she had somewhere warm to go, whether she needed help immediately. Simple questions. Human questions. At first, she answered carefully, almost as if she feared saying too much would make the situation heavier. But kindness often opens doors grief has locked. Slowly, pieces of her story emerged. Her husband had died, work had disappeared, housing had been lost, and the grave had become the only place where she still felt close to something she had not entirely lost. The officer listened without interrupting. Some moments in life do not require solutions immediately. They first require someone willing to listen without turning pain into suspicion. The cold that night was sharp enough to make staying there dangerous, so he made a quiet decision. He arranged a motel room for her that same night. A simple room, warm walls, a bed, a door that closed safely. For someone who had spent nights beside stone and cold air, that room felt almost unreal. She entered carefully, as if unsure she was allowed to believe temporary comfort could still belong to her. The bed looked ordinary, but grief often makes ordinary comfort feel extraordinary. She sat down and began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the kind of tears that come when survival suddenly pauses long enough for emotion to catch up. But one night in safety was not enough. The officer understood that if help ended there, the problem would simply return in another form. True kindness does not only solve tonight, it thinks about tomorrow. So the next morning, he began making calls, asking whether anyone nearby could help provide something more stable. Sometimes, one compassionate person becomes the beginning of a larger chain of goodness. A local connection led to a conversation with people willing to help beyond temporary shelter. A college nearby had a possible space available. What began as concern in a cemetery slowly became a community effort. While she sat uncertain about what would happen next, people she had never met were discussing where she might sleep safely, how she could begin again, and whether dignity could be restored one practical step at a time. The remarkable thing about human kindness is that it often arrives quietly. No cameras, no applause, just people deciding another person should not remain invisible. Arrangements were made carefully. A room was prepared, simple furniture, clean sheets, warm light. For those who have always had shelter, such things seem ordinary. But for someone who has spent nights beside grief and cold ground, they become almost sacred. Every folded blanket becomes evidence that life has not fully abandoned them. When she arrived and saw the room prepared for her, she stopped at the doorway before stepping inside. Sometimes hope feels frightening when pain has lasted too long. Her eyes moved slowly across the room as though she needed proof that it was real. A bed, a chair, Clean space, warm air, the kind of ordinary safety many people never think about because they have never lost it. She placed her small belongings down carefully, almost apologetically, as if afraid she might disturb something she had not earned. But kindness is not earned through perfection. Sometimes it is given because human beings simply need one another. In that quiet room, grief did not disappear, but for the first time in many weeks, it no longer stood alone beside fear. She sat down and cried again, this time differently. Not from despair, but from the sudden shock of being seen. There is something powerful about being noticed when you expected the world had stopped looking. She thought about the grave, about her husband, about how strange life had become. Only days earlier she had expected another cold night outside. Now there was warmth around her. Yet grief still whispered that nothing truly changes quickly. But kindness had already begun changing something deeper, her belief that tomorrow might still hold a place for her. Days later, support continued. Temporary help slowly opened the door to something more stable. Arrangements were made for longer housing, and eventually she received keys to a small apartment. Keys are ordinary until you lose the right to use them. Then they become symbols of dignity returning. When those keys touched her hand, they carried more than access to a room. They carried permission to begin again. A place to sleep, a place to wake up without fear, a place where grief could exist without cold ground beneath it. She walked into that apartment quietly, almost with disbelief. The walls were simple, the rooms modest, but for her it felt larger than luxury because it represented safety. She touched the counter, opened a window, stood still for a moment as if listening to silence that no longer felt threatening. Sometimes recovery begins not with happiness, but with relief. Deep, quiet relief. And relief often looks almost like disbelief when someone has suffered too long. She thought again of the officer who first chose understanding over judgment. Had he arrived differently that night? Had he spoken harshly? Had he dismissed her? Had he simply told her to leave? The story may have gone another way entirely. Many people imagine that kindness requires grand power or wealth, but often it begins with a pause before judgment. One person deciding not to assume the worst. One question asked gently instead of sharply. One moment where humanity is chosen before opinion. The officer could have seen only a woman sleeping in a cemetery and treated her like a problem to remove. Instead, he looked deeper and found a story hidden beneath silence. And that changed everything. We live in a world where many people carry private losses invisible to everyone around them. Someone may appear distant because they are grieving. Someone may seem weak because they are exhausted from surviving. Someone may stand in unusual places because ordinary places no longer feel safe. Yet because pain is invisible, people often judge quickly. They see behavior, not history. They see appearance, not heartbreak. They see one moment, not the long road that led there. This story reminds us that compassion often begins where assumptions end. And perhaps the most powerful part of the story is that nothing miraculous happened in one dramatic instant. There was no sudden fortune, no perfect ending falling from the sky. What happened was simpler and more realistic. One person cared, then others cared too, and step by step a life moved away from the edge. That is how many real recoveries happen. Slowly, quietly, through people who choose not to turn away. Her husband was still gone. Grief would still remain. Some mornings would still be difficult. But now grief had shelter around it. And shelter changes what pain feels like. It becomes survivable. She still visited the grave, but now she could return afterward to warmth, not darkness. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson here. Kindness does not erase pain, but it gives pain a place where healing becomes possible. So the next time you see someone in a place that does not make sense, before deciding who they are, pause for one moment longer. Ask yourself what story may exist that you cannot yet see. Because some people are not where they are because they failed. Some are there because life struck harder than expected. And sometimes the person the world is ready to dismiss is only one gentle act away from standing again. Do not judge too quickly. Understanding often arrives after the first impression. And when understanding arrives, judgment becomes smaller. Because behind many silent faces are battles no stranger can immediately understand. Sometimes, the greatest thing we can offer another human being is not advice, not correction, not opinion, but simple human kindness given before the full story is known. And sometimes that kindness becomes the reason someone believes life still has room for hope.